Coming up next on Arizona Horizon, a debate on a new law that increases campaign contribution limits in Arizona. That law is being challenged in court. We'll hear from both sides of the issue. And Avondale Mayor Marie Lopez Rogers talks about her meeting last week with the nation's Secretary of Education. Those stories next on Arizona Horizon.
Arizona Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Eight, members of your Arizona PBS station. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Arizona Horizon. I'm Ted Simons. 9 people wearing caps and gowns were detained today by Immigration and Customs officers for trying to test U.S. immigration law by crossing the border at Nogales. Those detained were so-called dreamers who grew up in the U.S. after being brought here illegally at a young age. And State Attorney General Tom Horne is investigating the Glendale City Council for open meetings law violations. Possible violations occurred during private meetings between city council members, National Hockey League officials, and the prospective buyers of the Phoenix Coyotes. The investigation was started after complaints were filed that the council conducted meetings without a quorum. A new state law raises campaign contribution limits in Arizona. It's being challenged in court. The suit claims that the law violates the state's Voter Protection Act, which prohibits the legislature from making substantial changes to laws approved by voters. Joining us now is Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery, who favors the law, and Lewis Hoffman, a commissioner from the Citizens Clean Elections Commission. He and the commission among those suing the state. Good to have you both here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ted.
Let's set some groundwork here. What does this new law do?
Well, the new law addresses a very important gaping hole in our campaign finance system by raising to a more competitive level how much an individual can contribute directly to a candidate. And it's increased up to $2,500, but with the 20% reduction in law, it'll be $2,000 for each election, primaries and campaigns, the same way that Clean Elections divides up money for participating candidates. Additionally, it requires trigger reports. If a candidate within 20 days of an election receives a contribution of $1,000 or more from a single source, they've got to report it. And if over the course of the campaign they receive a contribution from a single source of $1,000 or more, then they've got to provide notice of that within 72 hours of receiving it.
Is that how you see this new law?
Well, it's true that those are the limits. What Mr. Montgomery didn't say was that those limits are in some cases removed entirely, and in most other cases increased by a factor of 9 or 10, 9 the way with the reduction that he described. So the voters in Arizona decided in 1998 to limit the size of campaign contributions, and had decided that for a decade earlier than that. And this bill basically makes a tenfold increase without following the procedures set by the Voter Protection Law.
I want to get to those procedures in a second, but first of all, why is this law necessary? Why should the caps on individuals and super PACs and such, why should they be increased?
Well, now, the increase in contributions that an individual can make to a candidate is in many ways reflective of 2 instances in which the U.S. Supreme Court has cautioned Arizona about how low our limits are. First, in 2006, in a case of Randall v. Sorrell, Arizona, along with a handful of other states, were basically called out in a footnote in that case that our contribution limits were very low. And then in 2011, with the Free Enterprise Club case against Secretary Bennett, the U.S. Supreme Court, in fact, stated that Arizona's contribution limits, the austere contribution limits, were among the most austere in the United States. So they've been low, they've been recognized as low. The fact that you can say that it's a 9-fold increase isn't reflective of an outrageous amount. $2,000 is where it's at. There are 30 other states in the nation that are greater than $2,000. And this year, 5 other states increased their contribution limits. Wyoming to $2,500, Florida to $3,000, Minnesota to $4,000, and that incredibly large state of Maryland to $6,000. So even when you look at all of those states that increase, we're still at the bottom of that.
Are Arizona contribution limits too low, and does this new law not address a problem?
Well, if there's a problem to be cured with low contribution limits, the answer is not to simply ignore what the voters did and go ahead and pass a tenfold increase without following the procedures specified. The law is not unconstitutionally low. The cases that Mr. Montgomery cited to the contrary, but if you're going to avoid a problem because of perceived, let me just say, we've had contribution limits in this state for 26 years, and in no time has anyone even challenged the constitutionality of the statute in a court case until about a month ago. But if there's some perception that maybe these are too low to be unconstitutional based on reading tea leaves, then a challenge could be made. But if you're going to raise the rates in any statute in the state, you have to comply with the Arizona Constitution, which gives you a mechanism for how to do that. And the Supreme Court simply ignored that.
The idea that you can't change voter-approved measures without the voters approving the changes, that seems to be the crux of the suit. How do you respond?
I think it's a shameful assertion by a government agency that now has gone beyond its own bounds. And I think this is going to be Exhibit A next session when the legislature goes to get rid of the Clean Elections Commission. In fact, this argument is anything but clean. The Voter Protection Act, as it pertains to the Citizens Clean Elections Initiative when it was first passed, doesn't require the state of Arizona to leave untouched or have to pass with a supermajority the actual amount. There's a provision that addresses the contribution limit statute, but that's it. It has a reference to it. This argument is breathtaking. What it would mean then, though, Ted, is just because an initiative addresses a particular statute, if the Arizona Supreme Court were to rule that, yep, that brings it into voter protection under the Voter Protection Act, then within the next few cycles, you will have special interest groups pass initiatives and merely reference an entire section of statute, and then according to this argument, handcuff the legislature and prevent them from being able to address unconstitutional circumstances like what we have right now.
So you're saying references and provisions not the same as the law in total?
Correct. Within the Clean Elections Initiative, now look, those who drafted it could have set a limit to start with. They didn't. But that kind of inartful drafting is something that we see with the initiative process in Arizona time and time again. We saw problematic arguments being made too with the Top 2 initiative. But that notwithstanding, within the Clean Elections Initiative itself, all it says is that for the limits that are in 16905, you're going to reduce by 20%, and then the Secretary of State has an additional mechanism by which they can be raised, looking at inflation and another measure. If you're going to limit the legislature's constitutional authority to pass legislation, you have to do more than just give a wink and a nod at another statute. It's got to be explicitly based. Look, this is awful. The Voter Protection Act was meant in some ways to say to the legislature, look, you want to change this, you got to further it. But if you start off with a law that's problematic, you can't further a problem. The legislature has got to have the ability to address it. And there's no harm that can be stated by anybody in this lawsuit. The Clean Elections Commission has no authority to bring it, and everything else is speculative.
Respond, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, the voters set up the commission, and the voters of the state of Arizona assigned our commission the duty precisely to defend the choice of the voters to limit campaign contributions. We're doing our duty and our job here, as the I was the lead person drafting the statute, and I wrote this particular statute. With all due respect to my learned colleague, it does not say what simply give a wink and a nod to the other statute that sets forth limits. What it says is that a non-participating candidate shall not accept an amount that is higher than a certain specified limit. The limit is specified by referring to the list of numbers that were in the statute that defined the separate amounts to do. It said, could the legislature have simply ignored the will of the voters when we said that the limit should be, say, $440, and reduced that 20%, and then the next day gone back and just increased it 20% again, just for the sake of it? This is the sort of legislative finagling and shenanigans that voters don't like. And that courts have seen through that ruse, and I think we'll see whether Mr. Montgomery is right about his prediction of whether this gets rejected or not. But the court has time and time again said that the legislature does not have the power, the citizens retain the power to the legislature does not have the power to make either direct or indirect cuts to initiative or feedback on voter initiatives.
The idea of the will of the voters, some would argue the will of the voters relatively clear in this. Are you saying not necessarily?
No, well, here's what voters were promised when they voted for this. First, they were told that if you pass the Clean Elections Initiative, you're going to diminish the influence of special interests in Arizona. No. Instead, because we have this closed contribution system and artificially low limits, that money has gone to independent expenditures into PACs. Next, we were told that if you did this, this would increase citizen participation in elections. No, hasn't done a darn thing to increase voter turnout. And the local paper, every election cycle, keeps trying to de-kookify the legislature. And then the third point to this was that we were promised, that it would promote free speech. And yet one of the cornerstones of the Clean Elections Initiative, matching funds, was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court because it violated free speech. By unfairly and unreasonably limiting the contribution limits, we forced people who want to exercise their First Amendment right to seek other avenues to be able to influence elections. And that's what people have been doing. If we want to be able to track money and see who it's going to and how it's being spent, you do it to candidates. In the same opinion in which I referenced the Supreme Court's characterization of our contribution limits as austere, they also said we had a very robust financial reporting system. So if we want to know where money's going, you give it to a candidate who's got to report it on a frequent schedule and also report who gave it to them, the amount, where they worked. Look, we have a different ability today than we did when the Citizens Clean Elections Initiative was first passed for voters to see who's giving money to who and how much. People have computers now. The reports on a database on the Secretary of State's website are searchable, so voters can do that. All this argument about corruption and all the other nonsense that was offered back then, it hasn't come to fruition. The promises haven't been made. So when we talk about will of the voter, let's look at the cornerstone element of that. The will of the voter is to know who's trying to influence who and to how much. But the other side of that coin is giving voters the ability for them to exercise their free speech.
How much, what the county attorney talks about regarding the fallout from the Clean Elections Law, the campaign limits, and the whole 9 yards, how much of that does come into play when you do talk about the will of the voters who wanted perhaps A, B, and C, but are getting X, Y, and Z?
Well, Clean Elections is never intended to solve every problem there is with the world or with elections. It was intended to provide an additional path so that candidates who didn't have access to special sources of money would be able to run regardless. The point of the Supreme Court cases talking about the limits is to make sure that there's a path where a candidate can run for office. And if you can if you unconstitutionally low limits, that abridges the right of the candidate to run an effective campaign. In Arizona, we don't have that. We don't have any track record of that. We don't have any track record of candidates being stopped from running. And if they did have an inability to run under the limits that exist or existed, they could easily go and run during clean elections. So we increase First Amendment speech by allowing more candidates to get their speech out. With regard to your question about independent and Mr. Montgomery's point about independent expenditures, I share your concern about the disclosure and the influence on elections outside of the normal channel of giving money to elections. Clean Elections Commission is doing something about that. I'd be happy to speak with you or other people in the legislature about it, but it's not an excuse to violate the First Voter Protection Act of the Arizona Constitution.
Last point, very quickly. Contribution limits set in the Clean Elections Law, contribution limits messed with, if you will, by this particular law. How does that not wind up in court?
Well, first off, you have to show an actual harm. You set aside the bogus voter protection argument because, again, it tries to stretch the furtherance and the supermajority requirements to the stretching point. Aside from that, there's no identifiable harm. Here's how this should have gone, Ted. You had the legislature act responsibly and say that, in one point to make real quickly, the average amount raised by those running in legislative districts the last cycle was about $26,000. That exceeded that was less than what it would cost someone to be able to send a letter to all the registered voters in their district. It's not working in that regard. But the other point to be made is that what really should happen here is let's go through a cycle, let's see exactly what people can raise. It's a limit, it's not a guarantee. And then if those who want to run as a clean elections candidate are somehow disadvantaged, then they can say this is exactly what we need to raise those limits to, and I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, very quickly, final word.
Well, $26,000, you just gave the figure. You could raise that by having a living room managed by a big donor with 13 people giving you $2,000. The policy of the Clean Elections Act was to raise your money in bite-sized portions or run clean.
All right, gentlemen, we do have to stop it right there. Good discussion. Good to have you both here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
hear from you. Submit your questions, comments, and concerns via email at arizonahorizon@asu.edu.
Avondale Mayor Marie Lopez Rogers met with U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan along with other mayors and school superintendents last week in Washington. The meeting focused on partnership opportunities between cities and the U.S. Department of Education to create effective approaches to education reform. For more on the meeting, we welcome Mayor Rogers, who serves as president of the National League of Cities. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk more about this meeting with Secretary. What was this all about here?
Well, at the National League of Cities, we have a task force, an education task force, which our first vice president, our second vice president, both from one from Minnesota, one from Salt Lake, are chairing this task force, and we feel the need to be at the table when it comes to education policy. And so mayors are coming together all over the country, and we need to make sure that they're listening to us.
And what do you want them to hear? Why should they be listening to you?
Well, there is certainly an opportunity, and education is global. Certainly it's an economic impact to all cities and towns across the nation if our education system isn't where it needs to be. So we want them to understand that we need to be at the table when they're talking about policy that may affect us. And mayors across the nation, certainly council members, are all working with their education folks to make a better community through education. And so we want that for them to hear. And I know that it is a priority for the administration as well.
Has that partnership been a little lopsided in the past?
Well, we have antiquated policy that's been around for a very long time, and I don't know that it's working as it used to be at this point in time. And so we want them to make sure that they take another look at it and see if we can't help them to restructure it.
Let's talk about some issues of concern here. I noticed that balancing accountability with schools and teachers and cities, accountability was a word used here. What does that mean, and how does that refer to what you're looking at here as a group?
Well, the accountability is certainly making sure that they're having a tough time, just as we're having a tough time in cities. And so the accountability needs to be not only at the teacher level, making sure that the teachers are teaching the children what they need to be learning, but certainly the funding level is also critical for them as well. So there's got to be accountability not only from the federals, but from the state and certainly the local officials.
I noticed turning schools into centers for the community, providing wraparound services to kids and families. That sounds like a community center to me.
It does sound like a community center, and we're just trying to incorporate those services that are badly needed in the schools. They're losing a lot of the music, they're losing certainly some of those critical services, whether it's counseling or, and we're able, with our partnerships with our nonprofits, to support their efforts. And so that's what we're trying to do, is making sure that we're supporting their efforts.
And when you approach the secretary, the education chief, on something like this, on a federal level, again, how do you make that relevant? How do you get a response out of him that's going to make some sense?
Well, certainly all the mayors that were there at the table were giving stories of their own cities and towns and what they're working on and how they're struggling to make sure it happens. One instance is the municipal tax bond. I mean, that's going to be critical not only to the cities, but to the schools. And so that's an issue that's going to be critical as they're moving forward on the budget.
You have another issue of concern is to build a cradle-to-career model. Explain, please.
Well, certainly before children are born, you need to have prenatal care. You certainly have to grow up in a healthy home, and then hopefully continue their education, making education a priority, having parents involved in their schooling, and these days it's very difficult for them to do that.
And again, what can the feds do to help strengthen this educational pipeline, if you will?
Well, some of the policies that they're working on right now will probably need to be fine-tuned so that, and we want to again be at the table so that we can have some input on what that means when we're working together on that.
Yeah, another issue here is promoting college access. What is holding back college access now?
Well, there's a lot of things going on. They're all different across the nation. So whether it's tuition or first-time going to college or being able to access that level, or whether it's community colleges that can be helpful. There's many places that they could be working on, and we just want to ensure that our children are receiving the education into the future.
So again, as far as the municipal perspectives, do they differ? Did they differ much from city to state to federal?
They really didn't. I mean, we all have the same issues, whether it's just education, getting children to continue their education, parent involvement, schools being challenged, whether it's funding or teachers, or it's across the nation. Nothing has really changed too much in that realm.
And so what can cities do then to further the process and to, again, get that partnership going and maybe get to, as you say, a place at the table, at least a more prominent place at the table?
Right, and certainly within my own city, we have a council that we have 6 council members, 6 school districts. Each council member is assigned a school district. We try to keep that open dialogue with the school. We've had a conference, if you will, in our city so that we can have that communication well between their citizens, our schools, and the nonprofits, so to do the wraparound services.
When you meet with other mayors around the country, and obviously they can be very different, there are different approaches and different ways of looking at things, but what are some of the things you see, some of the reforms that you find in common with others?
Well, I think the reform is actually speaking to the school districts. I think that hasn't been done for a long time. I think it's kind of been territorial, if you will, but I think we've learned that we need to work together in order to ensure that it's all about the family. It's all about the child in that family, and we need to ensure that they succeed.
Is that message getting through?
I certainly hope so. I think that it is a priority for them. Certainly Secretary Duncan said he will partner with us and they will work with us.
I was going to ask, when you were at the meeting, obviously he was listening, was he also speaking, and what did you get out of the meeting? What did after you left, anything tangible or just kind of a pep rally, so to speak? What happened here?
Well, it was our first really meeting with him as a task force. We're going to go back as a task force and reevaluate where we are, what are our next steps, and then certainly include the Education Office as our partner. And I felt from his conversation that he was willing to do that, and he had quite a number of staff there to do that as well.
So what does come next? What do you want to see come of this?
Well, there's a lot to do yet, and there's a lot of mayors to talk to, and certainly a lot to do. Next steps will be to gather ourselves back together, figure out, what are those next steps? What are we going to do next to ensure our National League of Cities has a youth education and families department that actually does white papers for cities and towns. And so for me, it's to engage and educate our membership in order to create a better place for them.
Last week we talked about, had Mayor Stanton here and some others folks, community leaders, talking about how some are seeing the balance of power shifting more towards cities and away from state and away from federal. It's almost like little city-states are growing out there. Are you seeing that as well? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I see the same thing. I see that the mayors, we're visited every day at the grocery store or the laundromat or wherever we go, and so we're held accountable. And we see that there's a problem, and we just want to get the problem solved. And how do we do that if we don't do it together?
Well, Mayor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And tomorrow on Arizona Horizon, we'll hear about a set of new laws affecting HOAs. Those laws are now being challenged in court. And we'll look at a massive new wind energy project approved for northwestern Arizona. That's Tuesday evening, 5:30 and 10 on Arizona Horizon. That is it for now. I'm Ted Simons. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great evening.
Arizona Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of 8, members of your Arizona PBS station. Thank you.